Hello, and welcome to The Psychonaut Show. I'm Dr. John Burton. As a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist, I'm an explorer of the psyche, a psychonaut.
And I'm Dr. Tracy Seidsinger, a psychoanalytic psychologist, writer, mother, and fellow psychonaut.
And we're your hosts on this podcast that explores the rich history and insights of psychoanalysis, the powerful experiences of psychedelics, and where they come together to deepen understanding and relationship to our inner worlds.
Each episode, we will talk with an experienced pioneer who's working in this intersecting space. We'll journey together through questions, research, treatment, and mystery. Welcome along, dear psychonauts.
Hello, Dr. Tracy.
Hi, Dr. John.
So today, it's just the two of us talking. We're doing the second of our Journey So Far episodes, where the two of us reflect on the guests that we've had and their different voices and think about what they taught us and what we learned and how we've engaged with them.
Yeah, it's great to be here today with you and have this chance again to think about where each of us are at with thinking about psychedelics and psychoanalysis, and also the process of creating this podcast.
Yes, and we had some really great guests this last group. And what was interesting about them is that each one centered their conversation around a particular mental health category. You could even say psychiatric diagnosis. Dr. Larry talked about psychosis, Dr. Diana talked about autism, and Dr. Harold talked about PTSD. In some kind of cool ways, we're talking about starting in very standard psychiatric, psychological treatment that we're familiar with, but then each one kind of moved into these other areas of psychoanalysis and spirituality and other things that we're so interested in.
One of the things I've been thinking about is just how each person, of course, brings a different voice, of course, but I feel like I've never hosted a podcast before. I've interviewed tons of people in clinical work. I talk to people one-on-one all the time, but I'm noticing how it's a different process to have the two of us also be in conversation with people who I immensely respect and value their work, but in a real-time conversation where sometimes I don't know them very much from before our interview, and I'm passionate about these subjects, and they're passionate about these subjects. So it's really bringing up that to be engaged in conversation, sometimes we have conflict, or I have a perspective that I'll notice, oh, I think differently here in a way that I can't quite articulate in this short span of time. But the kind of conflict that's like, I want to get into it more and more because I'm so passionate. And each of our guests has been so passionate.
And so open, and I hear what you're saying. It's so important to be able to connect in conflict as a process that is constructive and moves things forward. Were there some places where you learned something that was useful, or maybe, as you were saying earlier, had some thoughts that were different than what some of the speakers brought up?
Something that's really been in some of our conversations too, and the research that's being done now, is where I'm really thinking about this is around how we think about the molecules in psychedelics or the journey itself. How are we thinking about the process? I think that most of our guests in these last 3 episodes as analysts, we probably share a point of view around the importance of the journey and the narrative aspects of the work. But I've definitely been thinking about that there's so many people in the psychedelic landscape right now who are working on isolating molecules. And that's sometimes a word that jars me because I care so much about the journey and the narrative. You and I have had conversations around this, that the word, molecules are in everything. Everything's a molecule. That I'm learning to listen more. I would be remiss to not listen to the folks who are doing that work.
So, for example, Dr. Diana talked about ketamine as a very interesting molecule.
Yes, that's true.
and others use different terms. But the word molecule, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that I get angry when that's the honest truth. When I hear efforts to isolate a molecule, not have a therapist, make psychedelic medicines as drugs that can be prescribed without a therapeutic process or intention, like other psychiatric drugs have been treated in a lot of ways. And that's so sad to me too. So that's where I come in to this conversation. But part of how I've been thinking about it and why I wanted to talk about it with you today is because I think I've been affected by the psychedelic work to see the reality of each person's perspective with a bit more distance and respect. I'm glad to come to the conversation fired up, but in the kind of fired up way that says, I also want to hear what other people have to say. And I hope they're fired up too.
Yeah. And we also hope that our listeners will be fired up, and we want to encourage and welcome differing opinions, engaging in conflict, as well as the through lines that we find in this exploration of psychoanalysis and psychedelics. Even in terms of our own backgrounds, there's a difference. You have an initial training in Jungian psychoanalysis, depth psychology, as it's also called, and then relational psychoanalysis, where I have come more from an ego-psychological object relations point of view. And I have found that working with psychedelics has begun to allow me to understand, not that I didn't appreciate the relational perspective, but it wasn't my native language, if you will. And so you might talk about the intersubjective third or the field or things like that. And I would kind of say, well, it makes sense, but I didn't really get it. I still don't feel like I'm fluent in it, but I feel like working with psychedelics has begun to allow me to understand experientially both psychedelic work, but also the relational perspective.
You're absolutely right. I come with more of a relational background and approach to the work, and have sometimes gotten fired up about drive theorists. It's interesting, even in my personal psychedelic work, I've had experiences of seeing a different point of view. I remember actually having an experience of like, oh, I get it now. I get what the drive theorists were after.
Wow.
And then the need, sometimes it's so good to just hold on to what's inside and let it grow and not be so concerned with everything that's outside.
You mean socially in particular? Or
Socially,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Interpersonally.
Yeah. So just for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with some of the terminology that we're using, psychoanalysis has a history, and Freud, our founder, kind of encompassed all of the things that emerged later, although he didn't know it and couldn't really speak to it at the time. And it's sort of hard to go back and say what kind of theory he was developing because he didn't really know. You've written, Dr. Tracy, about the problem of his sort of discovering the importance of trauma and then abandoning it for fantasy. But both are relevant, and both the drive theory is relevant too. But just to kind of maybe lay that out very briefly, drives have to do with libido, everybody knows this, and aggression. Those are the two basic drives. And that a drive theorist sees the problem as being the management of the drives. Like, what are you doing with your sex drive? What are you doing with your aggressive drive? Let's come up with the best management strategy, if you will, for that, which kind of gets into ego psychology. Whereas ego psychology is more focused on the ego, which is the manager of the drives, manager of everything, manager of reality, manager of other people as superego, etc. And in fact, part of ego psychology is really looking at the superego. And some people have said that ego psychology is not ego psychology, but superego psychology. What is the superego doing? Examine the defenses to the drives. Don't try to just get to the drives and reveal them, but look at what's going on with them. Look at how we're managing things. That would be how I would think of an ego psychological, in a nutshell. And then the object relations theorists looked at how we manage relationships, but the idea is that we internalize, like we are a composite of internalized early 6 months old experiences of neglected child, depressed mother, or sadistic father, submissive child, and these are caricatures, of course, but that we exist as a composite, not of our memories, but of memories of relationship, and that we hold both sides of those in us. And in terms of trauma, victim and perpetrator, both of those exist with us. That's an object relations point of view. And of course, there's self-psychology that's focused on the management of self-esteem. We talked about that with Dr. Alexa. And then there was the relational turn with Mitchell and Greenberg that really started coming at all of this stuff in a different kind of way. But all of them have some point, as you were saying, like psychedelics allowed me to say, oh, the drive theorists like have a point. And for me, in my working with psychedelics, really only ketamine, because that's what we were allowed to work with at this point. From my background, the way that I would teach is that you could look at relationships as a new relationship, an old relationship, and a real relationship. So the old is my baggage from the past, the transference. The new is, this is a new experience where I'm being listened to and taken seriously and not judged. And that changes me. It's particularly important with children, also with adults, and maybe this segues into the relational turn. And then the real is just like who you are, what's your gender, how old are you, blah, blah, blah. And that those have meaning, but they're not baggage from the past. And as I've been doing ketamine sessions and holding space for patients, I'm like, oh, there's some other kind of relating that's not new in the way that we normally think of new or old, or definitely not real. It's another state of consciousness that I'm just beginning to kind of think about and understand and try to figure out, but definitely feel like that is important. And in the very beginnings of my understanding about psychedelics, and to be honest, although the relational turn happened like 40 years ago, wasn't my training, and I'm just kind of, through you and other people, understanding what it's about, beginning to feel like maybe I get it more than I did before.
Yeah, it's interesting, even when you're describing in ego psychology the new relationship, it sounds pretty relational to me. The use of the therapist as a new relationship, as I hear it, doesn't inherently suggest that it will be non-judgmental or listening, but that's a particular way this relationship will be different.
Yeah.
Will be better, perhaps. That calls to mind some of the ideas of a reparative therapeutic relationship. I think that relational psychoanalysis has a lot more nuances than that, too. It's interesting because a lot of our guests talked in their own ways about the relational aspects of psychedelic psychoanalysis.
Yeah, they all did, and this is really becoming a through line, isn't it, in the show?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's also, like, as you're saying that you're maybe listening more to what a relational perspective is, I'm also having my own perspective of maybe how I've also idealized a therapeutic relationship as a reparative relationship, and kind of coming down from that. I'm my own view of what the relationship, what the point is, how important the relationship is in the work is changing. Not to say it's no longer important, but it's changing.
It's so interesting because we're coming at it from these different perspectives, backgrounds, and we're getting more modest about where we come from and appreciative about what's on the other side. And I so appreciate you're saying maybe it's not all the relationship, but like what goes on within the individual is really important too. And for me, it's like, oh, what goes on within the individual is really powerful. And also, it completely happens in the matrix of their experience of other people.
Yeah. So how would you say you're thinking now about where the relationship plays into a psychedelic experience?
This is really new for me, and I'm just beginning to like even just see the door opening, and there's something to understand and explore, and I'm very excited to do that. And this podcast is really inspired by that, wanting to figure this stuff out. So I don't have a worked out answer to that question. I can tell you some of my experience. One thing is that when you're holding space for somebody in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, I'm using the term holding space because that's what people use now.
I like
It's
it.
almost a
I like it.
cliche. I like it too, but it's also, it doesn't do justice to what you're doing. Like holding space it has a little bit of a passive connotation to me, where it actually is a lot of work a lot of presence to be holding space.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's made me really pay attention to what do I need to do in everything that I am doing in being in relationship to this person who may well be eye mask and not talking. There's so much going on with me. And I think to add another piece to the answer to your question, it's a very, very embodied experience. When I do a psychedelic session with a patient, I have to pay attention to what is happening physically to me because I'm not talking that much, and neither are they. And I'm very aware of what's going on with us non-verbally, non-intellectually. And I feel like it's sort of opening the door and peering into something that I haven't, I know it's there, but haven't really looked hard at it.
I want to direct our listeners back to the episode with Larry. And if you're listening to this now and haven't listened to the episode with Larry Fischman, I highly recommend that you do about this issue of the relationship in a psychedelic experience. I think that's something that, John, you and I have been talking about as we go through this work is how some people who are in the psychedelic space are doing fabulous, important work, honing in on the ceremonial intention and making sure to highlight, to guide people in that way with ceremonial intention that is perhaps spiritual. That's something that's been a part of psychedelic work long before it entered the medical field, as we might think about medicine in kind of Western scientific terms. But I value that so much. And I really appreciate the people who are leading that work today. And also recognizing that where we're leaning into maybe the relational, transferential, psychoanalytic components, how there's a little bit of differentiation that we have ceremony in our work, even in analysis and the setting of the frame of the time of when we close the door and how we enter into that space. But it's not ceremony in the same way. However, the relationship is so tied to what we bring as analysts, I think. And that's becoming more and more clear to me, especially through these last 3 guests that we've spoken with.
I think you should say a little more about ceremony and what I think many of our listeners will feel like they know exactly what you're talking about. But I think in the spirit of psychoanalysis and always being curious and not taking anything for granted, we should try to talk more about that, the conversation that we had with Dr. Harold. And he for almost being our most straight down the middle guest, working in the government and not doing psychedelics himself, was the one who talked most about ceremony and
That's
magic
true.
and the importance of this in the human experience. I'd love it if you would talk more about how you see ceremony courses amongst people and relational in that way, but
Mhm.
what that is that's different than what we do. And sorry to go on to I'll let you speak.
Mm-mm.
Just, I agree with you 100%. We have a ceremony in what we do. It starts and ends at a certain time. People lie on the couch a lot of the time. There's a ceremony to this. Even when I was learning to do psychedelic work, they would tell us, get a special bowl for your ketamine lozenges and present them to the patient and have a moment of
Mm.
silence, or maybe say a poem. All of this is ceremony. But it's not the same thing,
Yeah,
is it?
yeah. I mean, these are our attempts and they're beautiful and they're good, but my first answer to you would be I really hope that we have guests on in the future who are doing ceremonial work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They could speak to this much better than I could, but I'll do my best because I think that certainly Jungian archetypal psychoanalysis has recognized that too. Like Dr. Harold was talking about the kind of human psychic need to be part of collectives, part of rituals, rites of passage, and that the way that most of us live today is so cut off from that we don't even know how cut off from it we are.
Yeah.
I mean, most of us are not having experiences in the jungle. To put intention, like the bowl that you have the medicine in, is important, and any ounce of intention that we can put into the work is good. But there's probably, layers of ceremony that we don't even know because we've been cut off from it. Saying that I do hope we have those guests in the future who can speak to that piece. For right now, I think we have a lot that we can talk about the relational piece of the work, and where sometimes that is missing in other psychedelic spaces, and something then that psychoanalysis really is a strength that I think we're adding a value. I'll say a caveat, which is to where I have been changing in my understanding of how important the relationship is to the work. So I suppose I had, not only from my explicit training, but also my personhood and just things that I was picking up in the world around me, adopted this idea of a therapeutic reparative relationship. My parents were terrible, but I'll go to analysis and I'll have a good parent and then I'll be good, in the most simplistic expression.
There is that idea in psychoanalysis, which at least in my training did not agree or acknowledge that at all. But if you really look at the history, it goes back to the beginning with Sandor Ferenczi, I would say.
Yes. I'm going to say that I do agree with that to some degree, but with this caveat. I'll admit, which some people might not like to hear at all, that I personally have worked with 4 analysts. Some of that is because I've had to move to a different state or move to a different training institute, and that's part of the requirement. And I love and respect and learned a great deal from each of them. But one of them said to me at one point, if I would do whatever tarot reading or meet with somebody else or something that was a part of my personal process between our sessions, oh, you were cleaning the house before the cleaners came again. Sort of this admonition that all of your psychic work is supposed to happen here and not elsewhere.
That was my training analysis for sure. I mean, I feel you, Dr. Tracy. My analyst said, when you have a dream, do not tell anyone until you come here. And there's something about that. I mean, there is something special about that, but it is a certain way of working that I think it's amazing that you've had 4 different experiences and can speak to that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that too, that there is something to kind of this monogamous relationship.
Fidelity,
A fidelity and a closed container where things don't get forgotten or dissociated or lost. But this is part of the generative conflict, and where I don't have all of the answers. I'm interested in asking the questions right now about what is that role of how important is the relationship? It's clearly very important. One of the things that Dr. Larry was talking about was also the medicine as another, maybe another subject. He didn't say this, but another part of the relationship. Now we have the introduction. There is the fidelity of the person that you're working with, the guide, the sitter, the therapist, but also there's the introduction of another element in the medicine, which is doing a lot of the work.
Yeah, something that goes beyond just one's individual internal experience and also beyond one's experience with individual other people.
Well, I think that with Larry, he was talking about the inner healing intelligence. So the simultaneity of the relationship being so important, but also is there an inner healing innate to the individual that's not, how dependent is this on the therapist or the person that is there in the room with someone undergoing a psychedelic experience? So all of those things that I said just now about the one therapist not being the be-all, end-all of anyone's healing or psychological experience, like I stand by that. But also that as a person is having really opening up to hopefully a transformative process, what often is a very transformative process, like you said, John, the person that you're in the room with, even if you're not exchanging words, very many words, makes a whole lot of difference. Who that person is, how they hold you in mind, what they even think is the possibility of intention to hold for a journey.
This reminds me of something that's, I know is very near and dear to your heart, which is maternality, matrescence. And I would say when I was doing my ketamine training, which was really my first psychedelic experience as an adult in this way, intentionally, I had the experience when I was sitting for people in the medicine. I have never been pregnant. Obviously, I don't know what that would be like. I don't know what it would be like to have young children. I don't have children. I'm a child psychiatrist, but I don't work with infants. But I had the very strong feeling like, oh, this is what a mother feels like. And I want to also be clear from a gender point of view. And I think this is something we'll also get into in later episodes. I know we will. One's gender identity, one's sex is not equivalent or determinative of motherhood, fatherhood, that there are certain experiences. And I think I'm also learning a lot about that. But when I use the word mother, I'm talking about Winnicott's mother, the person who is completely captivated by their infant. And when I can hold space, for lack of a better way of putting it, I felt not just intellectually, but like I felt like, oh, this is what that's like, being entirely attentive to this other person in a way that brings you into a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And it just occurred to me as we're talking about the therapeutic relationship, what is it? What is the psychoanalytic way of understanding it? But what might be ways beyond our usual psychoanalytic way of understanding it that blend into ceremony or other kinds of experiences?
Of course, I'm so excited that you brought up matrescence. You know, that's one of my big interests and passions. And actually, when we were talking with Dr. Larry, he talked not about matrescence, but something that I had thought of in my working with mothers. Actually, when he's talking about psychotic experiences and psychedelics, I was reminded of this quote from Joseph Campbell, which I actually had used in a paper that I wrote about, which I called Maternal Excess Transformation in the Perinatal Period, where Joseph Campbell talks about what are these different, sometimes overwhelming, but non-conscious experiences and encounters that can lead to transformation. And my point there in exploring it in that paper is that the perinatal period is a time of incredible transformation and encounter with what is usually not conscious, but that we don't usually talk about the matrescent transition as a transformative transition. And Joseph Campbell didn't, but I think his quote is pretty interesting. Is it okay with you if I share that?
I love Joseph Campbell. His Hero with a Thousand Faces is sitting on my side table next to my patients. And I've literally had some people say, I think I'm going to choose you because you have this book on the side table.
I believe it. That's fabulous. It's not in that book, but in Myths to Live By, he wrote, "The LSD phenomenon is an intentionally achieved schizophrenia with the expectation of a spontaneous remission. Yoga, too, is intentional schizophrenia. One breaks away from the world, plunging inward, and the ranges of vision experienced are in fact the same as those of a psychosis. But what then is the difference? What is the difference between a psychotic or LSD experience and a yogic or a mystical? The plunges are all into the same deep inward sea, but there is an important difference. The difference, to put it sharply, is equivalent simply to that between a diver who can swim and one who cannot. The mystic, endowed with native talents for this sort of thing and following stage by stage the instruction of a master, enters the waters and finds he can swim, whereas the schizophrenic, unprepared, unguided, and ungifted has fallen or has intentionally plunged and is drowning." That's the end of his quote. Very drastic, but I think sometimes it portrays what people who have real severe experiences with schizophrenia experience, is that, am I ever coming back, not knowing how to come back? I appreciated Larry so much for seeing the similarities with psychosis and the possibility, if it can also be a round trip ticket, as some people say.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's just an amazing concordance of ideas. Larry's talking about psychosis and the inner healing intelligence. We're talking about the therapeutic relationship in regard to that. This idea of matrescence that you've written about, and bringing in the Joseph Campbell quote that brings us back to Larry's ideas. Tu thought that was a very important distinction, that not only is it a round trip ticket for the mystic or the psychonaut, unlike for the schizophrenic, but it also is one of choice too. He really made that importance too, that I know that I'm going to enter this. Whereas, and he made the point about experiments that were done on military veterans, giving them LSD, when the military was experimenting on these potentially as weapons, that giving LSD to people who didn't know that they were getting it made them look just like somebody having an acute schizophrenic episode.
Yeah, even if that, when there is choice in going into a journey, that the choice is to go into something unknown, having any ounce of choice makes a tremendous difference.
Yes, and this is why in psychoanalysis, we're hopefully very respectful of people's defenses. That would be a psychoanalytic term. I like to call them management strategies. Like, I have complicated feelings to deal with, and this is how I deal with them. These are my strategies. And we respect that. And we don't just punch through our agenda or our interpretation, even though it might be justified, it might be correct. Where somebody is at is fundamental to what happens in these states and experiences.
That makes me think about maybe why some people, some researchers might be disinclined to think about the journey, because the journey, especially when it's unknown, is quite scary.
And this is, another, I think, really big topic. By big, I mean core topic that is coming out of
Mm-hmm.
these conversations that we're doing, and I think very important to both of us. And as I mentioned in our conversation with Dr. Deanna, the emergency physicians, which is where ketamine is used very frequently because it is so safe. It has very low risk of respiratory problems. It's used in children a lot because you can relocate a dislocated shoulder or operate on somebody in consciousness without having to undergo general anesthesia because ketamine takes care of that. But they don't want all of these other effects of the ketamine. They just want
That's
it
right.
to do the anesthesia, and they call that the emergent phenomenon and are looking for ways to kind of minimize that. And as you mentioned earlier about the molecules, different biotech companies are trying to create synthetic versions of these medicines, molecules, whatever you want to call them, that don't have the psychedelic effects that will be just for depression. And in fact, there was a study that just came out, a phase 3 study on LSD for major depression, a single dose, that found benefit to people's depression without any psychotherapy component whatsoever. And I really appreciated Dr. Deanna's comment that if we can find more options for people struggling with
Mm.
major psychiatric illness like major depression or treatment refractory depression, and we have a medicine to give them, then we should do that. We're not saying don't make these medicines, but what
Mm.
we're saying is let's look at what we're trying to do, and maybe there's another component of healing and transformation that isn't merely reduced to the biological. Steven Pinker, who is a well-known, written many popular books on cognitive neuropsychology, has described the mind is what the brain does. And I love that because it's not saying the mind's over here and the brain's over there, where they're going to be biological or psychological or spiritual, but they're all connected. They're all just different manifestations of things. And so we're interested in those other experiences with the journey and the experiences that one has. We feel like that's really useful and important.
Mm-hmm. And it does seem like that's something that our recent guests have brought up each in their own way, that the journey, not what we mean by a journey, but like the narrative components, the experience, having an experience, whether that's hallucinations, but something that does involve the mind is a big part of the process.
Yeah, I think experience is the best word. It's to have an experience that I don't have easy access to in my everyday existence and that I need to have.
Mm.
And Dr. Harold's
That's,
point
yeah.
was so important, I think, that you don't have to do psychedelics to have these
Mm.
experiences too.
Yes.
Hmm.
I'm going to think about that for a long time. That's very, I'm so glad you highlighted that experience may be the point.
Hmm. To go to, I think this connects to something that, again, you and I are very passionate about and interested in, and particularly interested in what does psychoanalysis have to say or not say about the mystical experience. And
Mm,
part of a mystical experience is not that now you know the meaning of life. That's not what that's
mm,
about. It's not an intellectual kind of aha thing. It is,
collecting the right answers.
right, exactly. It's an awareness of something, but it's not a aha knowledge kind of awareness. You and I, through this podcast, are trying to explore and understand better something we both feel, which is that is important, even
Hmm.
fundamental in healing and growth and
Right.
wellness, a well-lived life.
Right. And even if we come to words to describe it, it's like the words themselves aren't it. Sometimes you need the words to have the experience too.
Hmm. Do you have a thought after these three guests about, like, where are you with thinking about the role of the spiritual or the mystical or what we're still trying to put into words in terms of our work as therapists and healers?
Maybe this isn't a meta commentary, but something that really moved me was the conversation with Harold where he was talking about the biblical example of leprosy. What has stayed with me is the reality that people have experiences, sometimes traumatic, we might call them, where the world doesn't operate the way that we have come to understand it's supposed to operate. It's like something has gone wrong, that there's a need then to find answers, find experience, find meaning, find something elsewhere, because we sort of innately know when something's gone wrong that can't be all there is. So I've kind of, from that conversation, which he really jiggered something in me in a good way, I think that we talk a lot about, there's a lot of public talk about spiritual bypassing, of going over the experience of the world in front of you to have a spiritual ideal that misses reality. But he got me thinking about the need to go to maybe a spiritual realm, a psychedelic realm, something outside of the temporal, tangible world that's sitting in front of a person, or the traumatic experiences that have really hurt a person, to go somewhere else to say, is this all that there is? But actually, speaking again about the round trip ticket of coming back from psychedelic experiences or maybe spiritual experiences after a person has in fact encountered, that's not all there is. There might be a bigger perspective, a different order to things, and I don't know, people can experience infinite things in psychedelic journeys, but in my view, something is experienced that then oftentimes gives a person the capacity to come back to the world that they're in and see it differently and know that there is more than that sliver of experience, especially when it's been harmful experience, that can promote a way through life differently.
Yeah, I thought that was very profound too, that trauma and other challenges too can cause a crisis even of, I thought the world was a good, orderly place where things made sense.
Yeah.
And I've had an experience that's told me that's not true. It's not only an experience I don't know what to make sense of, but the whole thing doesn't make sense. If I told somebody everything will be okay, I would be lying. I don't know that.
Yep.
And how do you help? How do you move through that? And what these other states of consciousness give us is another way of looking at that helps us understand it. He was talking about ritual and ceremony. That was the leprosy. I think there's a biblical scholar who I've heard talk, who was one of the subjects in the Johns Hopkins study on psychedelics for religious professionals. And she talks about the Bible as being a series of psychedelic experiences of non-ordinary states where you see the characters kind of transform in this way. And I brought up with Dr. Harold, we didn't get a chance to get into it, but as he was talking, I thought that is the book of Job. You know, we always think of Job as like this guy who had all these horrible things happen to him because God was taking Satan up on his challenge or something. But the way that it ends isn't really in our mainstream association to Job. And what happens is Job goes through all of these, we'd call them traumas, is furious, but he hasn't given up. God then shows him essentially a psychedelic experience of there are so many things in the world that you don't know about, you don't see, you couldn't possibly understand. But what I'm going to give you is the knowledge, the sight of this bigger picture, which isn't an aha, oh, now I get it. It's a, oh, now I see I don't get it at all and never will, and I accept that. And that's really what the resolution of that is.
Well, that really speaks to the experience piece too.
Yeah.
That like it's one thing to know that and another to have that experience, and it's not forced upon you, but is felt. That's so fascinating to think about different passages from the Bible, and I imagine other religious texts as well as psychedelic experiences.
Well, you could say too, that is the entire Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu comes down to Arjuna and says, you're caught up in your own little neurotic thing about whether to fight or not fight, and let me show you the whole big picture.
Yeah, and I imagine there's so many other things that each of us could say about where we're thinking about spirituality right now in relation to all of this, but that seems particularly to the point of going elsewhere.
Yeah.
And having an expansive experience and coming back.
Yeah, and I want to be clear with you and our listeners that I'm not referencing the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita to say, like, these have the answer. Like, this is, to go back to your point at the beginning of the episode, like, this is the process of engaging and disagreeing and finding through lines. It is how we're going to understand better and figure things out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that comes across very clearly to me and reminds me of, before we started recording, you had mentioned to me that several of our last guests brought up Aldous Huxley, specifically the isness of a thing, that in Huxley's writing with psychedelics, there was more of this encounter with the reality, not just of oneself, but of the reality of all forms of life and isness around us. And I think that is the lens that I'm hearing you through when you talk about stories in the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or elsewhere. Not like, aha, this one is the end-all be-all, but there is a reality that can be experienced in it.
Yes.
And then there's another reality over here that sometimes we're touched by certain realities, and just being open to each of those.
Yeah, and you can't get to what Aldous Huxley was describing if you're looking for purpose, meaning, insight. It is literally, and that is the definition of having an experience. But you and I talked that it was quite synchronistic that the separate guests invoked Aldous Huxley on the same level. I mean, maybe not so much because we are talking about psychedelics, but like the way that they brought him in was very particular. We may have to get into that idea of the isness, the reality, in another episode more deeply.
I can see that. There's so many things that we could keep talking about. Are there other thoughts that you have pressing today?
There are so many things that we can talk about. I would love to talk more about the idea of play and the transitional space that Dr. Deanna brought up, but I have a feeling this is going to come up a lot. I love her formulation of that from a psychedelic point of view, and I think it's psychoanalysis doing a great job of engaging with psychedelics, but it's not the whole story. It's not the whole answer, as is the theme with everything here. So we'll leave that for future conversations.
So to be continued.
Yes. 100%. All right. It was great.
Well, I'm really looking forward to
it was a really fun conversation. I love unpacking these things with you. And just like you said, like having an opportunity to just kind of process with it without necessarily coming to some conclusion about what we've learned, but just to keep moving along.
Exactly. Yeah. We've got some great guests lined up next, and we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah. Yes, we will. Bye-bye.
Bye. This has been Dr. Tracy.
And Dr. John.
And thank you, dear Psychonauts, for joining us on this episode of The Psychonaut Show, the space where psychoanalysis and psychedelics rediscover one another.
Since we are all exploring together, you make the journey richer by subscribing to The Psychonaut Show wherever you get your podcasts, sharing with someone you think would be interested, and even leaving a rating. It helps others to find us. You can also follow us on Instagram @Psychonaut Show. And remember,
when we explore with a psychoanalytic mind and a psychedelic heart, all our worlds, imaginary, physical, personal, and social, become clearer and more connected.
Until our next journey,
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.